So the EU Pact on Migration and Asylum has been in the works for almost 10 years now, since the so-called migration crisis in 2015, related to the civil war in Syria. And basically, at the level of the European Union, there have been efforts for many years to try to harmonize asylum law and try to find ways to redistribute the quote unquote burden on external countries on the EU's borders to deal with asylum seekers. And it's a very long and tedious document that has a lot of internal contradictions, which is kind of usual for a lot of EU legislation because it is ultimately a compromise between different member states that have very different interests. But all in all, if you look at it, it introduces several things several new measures that codify the letter than the spirit of the 1951 Convention on Refugees. So some of the most worrying things in the text that have been highlighted by human rights organizations is the fact that it basically introduces the concept of accelerated asylum procedures at the border. And it introduces several different steps. Once this pact is codified into law in each of the member states, which will take some time, it's not immediate. Once that happens, basically, asylum seekers applying at EU external borders will go through a pre-screening procedure, which is a new procedure. And it only lasts 7 days. And during those 7 days, basically asylum officials, they look and consider whether an asylum case has a chance of being fulfilled. And so they track a person's identity, they fingerprint them. So there's also new legislation, or there are new components in the pact that allow for a lot more data collection from asylum seekers. So if before they were only fingerprinted, now they also write down very detailed biographical data. They take pictures, and all of this is uploaded to a central database that law enforcement from all EU member states will have access to. So during those first initial 7 days, during that pre-screening period, officials can assess whether an asylum seeker poses a security risk, whether they have a legitimate asylum case, and whether they come from a safe third country. The list of things that can be considered is quite long. And so if you look at it, 7 days is a really short period of time. And it basically means that already at this first initial stage, EU member states will be able to weed out asylum seekers that they do not want to enter without them ever going through the legal procedure, without them ever being in a courtroom. And as a result, so for example, one of the things that's being introduced is the fact that if an asylum seeker comes from a country where historically the recognition rate of asylum seekers is below 20%, then they can be basically turned around immediately. And their asylum case will not be processed, which goes against the Geneva Convention, because each asylum case should be processed individually on its own merit, right? So you're not supposed to generalize based on a person's citizenship, right? Each case is supposed to be individual. And these changes go against that. The pact also expands the ability of member states to detain people for longer periods of time, to keep them in kind of camp settings over a longer time period. It also introduces this new concept of detention centers at borders. So this will allow for the construction of temporary processing centers that will actually be detention centers at the border, because just so it's clear, before in the past, if someone came at the border and applied for asylum, they would often be transported to a temporary accommodation somewhere inside the country while the case is being processed. Now they would be detained immediately at the border and put in a processing center that's put immediately within the vicinity of the border crossing. It also introduces, it kind of codifies new concepts such as a migration crisis. So, right, migration crisis is kind of an abstract concept that, you know, we can see in the media, but it doesn't really exist in law. There's no such thing. There's no such legal category as a migration crisis. Well, now with the new EU Pact, it also introduces this idea of a migration crisis that can be activated. So member states can, there's a mechanism now in place where they can notify the EU and say that they believe a migration crisis is taking place. And that allows them to take special measures, so border closures, basically pushbacks, you know, not allowing people into the border and across the border, and that's very worrying because that gives a lot of leeway to EU member states to declare unilaterally on their own based on maybe their internal political considerations. They can declare a migration crisis where maybe there isn't actually one. And I mean, we've seen that before, right? How migration gets politicized. And so now this allows states to unilaterally declare a migration crisis situation. So that's also very worrying. The other thing that is again codified in this pact is the idea of a safe third country. So for now, each member state has its own list of what it considers to be safe third countries. That tends to change. And here you're seeing kind of an effort to centralize that. And we've seen over the past couple of years that the European Union has signed agreements with third countries on several levels. So first of all, to designate these third countries as safe third countries. So you could look, for example, at Turkey, Egypt, Tunisia. There's also been an agreement with Libya. I think there's one with Mauritania. So all these countries that are located on the outer edge of the European Union, and even now the second edge. So countries that are bordering countries that border the European Union, they're signing agreements that will effectively allow asylum seekers that come through those countries to be deported back, not to their countries of origin, right, but to countries with which they have no ties, but they just transited through, in exchange for significant funds. And this creates a very dangerous situation that we've seen where effectively these states can continue to blackmail the EU using migration. So we've seen that that's been a very effective mechanism with Turkey, where the European Union, I think through this pact, sends a signal that stopping asylum seekers and migration is the absolute #1 priority of the European Union's foreign policy. And when this becomes apparent to countries in the region, they'll use that in any way they can leverage that. And so I think it actually puts the European Union in a very vulnerable position politically when they sign these kinds of agreements. So I mean, to summarize, basically the European the EU Pact on Migration and Asylum has a lot of takes significant steps to reduce the ability for third country nationals to apply for asylum in the European Union. It also limits, it also expands detention, the ability to detain asylum seekers, and really chips away at some of the founding principles of the Geneva Convention on Refugees. One of the main kind of fundamental principles of the Geneva Convention is this idea of non-refoulement, which is that people who are seeking international protections in a country that outside of their own should not be forcibly sent back, right, or deported from that country. And this pact, definitely large sections of it go against those principles that are in the Geneva Convention. Well, it's a mix of different things, and it's I mean, first of all, it's obviously a massive pact that includes a lot of things that contradict one another. So there's certain things that are in there that I would say are a step in the right direction. For example, one of the big problems with the way that asylum applications were processed in Europe was the fact that it was always the first country of entry that was responsible for processing the asylum application, which was indeed an unfair burden on countries such as Italy or Hungary, Poland, Greece that received a lion's share of applications. And you would have other countries like, let's say, Sweden or the Netherlands that would basically never have asylum seekers applying at their border unless it was at the airport. And so there's an Article 26, for example, of the Pact gives asylum seekers the ability to notify authorities when they arrive that they have family members legally residing in other EU countries. And if that's the case, then the asylum application is transferred to that country. And that's definitely a positive thing because we've seen this with Syrian asylum seekers in the EU when they first arrived. People were spread out all over the place. You would have children separated from their parents, from siblings, grandparents, and so on. People would be all over and they would have to wait years to reunite. That has been, at least on paper, it has been simplified, and that's definitely a positive thing. Secondly, they've also introduced another criteria, which is if you can show that you have some sort of connection to a specific country in the EU, then that's also, there's a procedure now in place where you can petition to have your asylum claim processed by that country. So for example, if you graduated from a university, let's say in Germany, and you arrive by land and apply for asylum in Greece, I mean, it's not going to affect a lot of people, but you could argue that, well, I have a degree from Germany, so I'd like my asylum case to be processed in Germany, and now there's a legal procedure for that. So that's also positive. There's also some parts of the pact that are positive for unaccompanied minors. The well-being of the unaccompanied minor takes precedence over other considerations. Also, really, the principle of family reunification is really present and really strong in the pact. And also, they at least pay lip service to this idea that legal pathways of migration need to be developed as well. The problem is that it's always, I mean, the EU's migration and asylum policy has always been contradictory on many levels, right? It's been about deterring irregular migration, what they would call sort of effective and sustainable return. So basically having deportation mechanisms. So these are all very securitized kind of anti-migration goals. At the same time, the EU would say, well, we want to develop legal pathways of migration. So we want to provide more opportunities for people to move legally to the European Union. Obviously, all of these components are in contradiction to one another. And I would say the overall spirit of the pact is definitely more restrictive. There's certain elements still built into it that have been probably lobbied by different parties and different interests. That there are some elements that are positive, but looking at the overall number of arrivals and looking at the majority of cases, the majority of people will be negatively impacted by this pact. But certain categories, yes, there might be some silver linings in the pact, but overall, there's very few positive developments in the pact as a whole. Yeah, well, I mean that's obviously the idea behind it, but I think migration researchers have shown time and time again that every time there's an attempt to restrict migration with kind of very strict, I would say, police methods, they end up with the opposite result of what they initially intended to. And the reason for it is that, first of all, it doesn't take into consideration the reasons behind people's mobility. So there's an assumption that people make a kind of personal cost-benefit analysis and that they try to go to the place that's the easiest to get to, or that and that therefore you can somehow incentivize people to not move in certain directions as if people are constantly following policy changes. The reality of, if you look at the overwhelming numbers, if you look at the statistics, right, of people who apply for asylum in the European Union, there's a very clear connection to violence and civil unrest and political unrest. As soon as there is a political and military conflict somewhere within the EU vicinity, you see numbers go up. I mean, it's really not rocket science. It's not that complicated. Sure, there are obviously people who are also moving because there are, there's difficult socioeconomic conditions and these type of things. But overall, I mean, if you look at the statistics over the year, the spike is always, right? The spike in the 90s was because of the war in Yugoslavia. The spike that you saw in the 2000s was because of the chaos and civil war in Syria, in Iraq, in Afghanistan, right? So it's always linked to these cases of political violence. And if you don't address the root causes, not of migration, it's not about trying to keep people in their place and so on. But if you don't get at the root causes of political violence, then really this is kind of a pointless exercise, because people flee military conflicts and it makes sense, right, for their own survival. And we have a really strange situation where, for example, I think Afghanistan is a great example of that. When the West and the US disengaged from Afghanistan and withdrew, they knew that they left thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of people in a vulnerable situation facing the Taliban and so on. And there were promises to provide legal pathways to resettle these people to Europe, but these have not materialized. So if you're an Afghan who is facing an imminent threat of violence at the hand of the Taliban, for example, at the current moment, there are no avenues for you to come legally to the European Union. I mean, there are very few, almost next to impossible. So what are you left with as a choice? You can either stay in Afghanistan and face violence, right, or go into hiding, or you can pay your way on foot, using different, I don't necessarily like the word smugglers, but whatever, people who facilitate your travel, and you will cross it regularly to make it to the EU border. And it doesn't matter what procedures and restrictions are placed. If you have the choice between violence at home and maybe a 1% or whatever chance of making it to the EU, then you're going to take it. And also the important thing to keep in mind is that most people who are on the move actually have family connections in the EU. They're not moving blindly, to this idea of Europe. They're usually family ties there. But again, there are no legal procedures in place that would allow people to, apply at an embassy. And I mean, the document talks about legal pathways, but usually the legal pathways are all about employment and so on. And so we don't have any procedures for kind of humanitarian visas on a mass scale, not on an individual level. I don't think it'll have an impact on the numbers, because the numbers are being driven by what's happening elsewhere, not what's happening in Europe. What it will increase is the suffering of asylum seekers and migrants, and potentially, it will impact their health, their well-being. They could face violence and reprisals in so-called safe countries that the EU has signed agreements with that we know are actually not safe. So, I mean, migrants and asylum seekers will definitely suffer, but I don't think it will make a dent in numbers overall, because we're living in a time, unfortunately, where we're seeing, more wars, more violence, more displacement, and this reform has no effect on that.